A slow, gritty zoom on yellow newspaper clippings from 1930. The camera pushes closer to reveal a headline buried deep in the pages. Police find $1 million in counterfeit currency. Below it, a smaller article about Italian lottery raids in Greenwich Village. The images are grainy, faded, almost forgotten. New York, 1930. While the world watched headlines of the stock market crash and bread lines stretching around city blocks, a young Vito Genovese was playing a different game. This wasn't just street-level crime. This was the year police stumbled onto something that should have ended his career before it truly began. $1 million in fake currency in a Brooklyn warehouse. But instead of handcuffs and headlines, there was silence. Instead of a trial, there was nothing. While America collapsed into economic chaos, Genovese was building something that would outlast the Depression itself. Invisibility. The year 1930 wasn't just any year. It was the year everything fell apart. The stock market had crashed the previous October, and by 1930, New York City was drowning. 4 million Americans were out of work. Banks were failing at a rate of 10 per day. Bread lines snaked through Manhattan streets. Shanty towns called Hoovervilles sprouted in Central Park. The American dream had become a nightmare, and in that chaos, organized crime found fertile ground. For Vito Genovese, 1930 was a pivot point. He arrived in New York from Naples 17 years earlier as a 15-year-old kid with nothing. He'd started small, stealing fruit from pushcarts, running errands for local gangsters. By 19, he'd earned his first conviction, 1 year behind bars for illegal gun possession. But prison didn't rehabilitate Vito Genovese. It educated him. By the time Prohibition turned alcohol into liquid gold, Genovese had learned the most important lesson of organized crime. Real power doesn't come from being the loudest or the most visible. It comes from being indispensable. In the early 1920s, Genovese went to work for Giuseppe Joe the Boss Mafia, the most powerful Italian gangster in Manhattan. Mafia ran bootlegging operations, speakeasies, gambling houses, and protection rackets. But what he needed most was muscle, and Genovese provided it. He was Mafia's enforcer, his problem solver, the man who made people understand consequences. Alongside his friend Charles Lucky Luciano, Genovese became one of Mafia's top lieutenants. But Genovese had something more valuable than muscle. He had a territory. Greenwich Village became his kingdom, a small patch of Manhattan where he ran the rackets with surgical precision. Narcotics, prostitution, bootlegging, and most lucratively, the numbers game. The Italian lottery, as it was called, was a form of illegal gambling where players bet on 3-digit numbers. The payoffs were enormous. According to testimony that would emerge years later from Genovese's own wife during their bitter divorce, he ruled the Italian lottery in New York and New Jersey, bringing in over $1 million per year. That's roughly $18 million in today's money. Every year. Tax-free. Unregulated. Invisible. This is where Genovese's real genius showed itself. His second-in-command in Greenwich Village was Tony Benderstrollo, a specialist in illegal lotteries who eventually bankrolled nightclubs, burlesque joints, and gay bars with his profits. Tommy Ryan-Aboli, a volatile ex-boxer, provided the muscle. Mike Miranda, a gunman and narcotics pusher, rounded out the crew. Together, they controlled the village with a combination of violence and corruption that made them untouchable. And then came the counterfeiting case. In 1930, police raided a workshop in Bath Beach, Brooklyn. What they found should have been front-page news. $1 million in counterfeit United States currency. Not small bills. Not a few $1,000s. $1 million in fake money. Professionally printed, ready to flood the economy. Genovese was indicted on counterfeiting charges. For most criminals, this would have been the end. $1 million in fake currency was federal. It was serious. It was the kind of case that put men away for decades. But here's what didn't happen. Genovese didn't go to trial. The case didn't make national headlines. The charges quietly evaporated. No conviction. No prison time. Nothing. The indictment became a footnote, barely mentioned in the newspapers that bothered to cover it all. For a man who would later be described in a 1958 Bureau of Prisons report as suave, shrewd, cruel, calculating, cunning, ruthless individual who would use any means to accomplish his objectives. This wasn't luck. It was strategy. How does $1 million counterfeiting case disappear? The answer lies in understanding what New York looked like in 1930. This was a city with clean cops and functioning institutions. This was a city drowning in corruption at every level. Police officers moonlighted as enforcers for bootleggers. Judges accepted cash payments to lose evidence. Prosecutors looked the other way for the right price. The entire system was for sale, and Genovese understood that better than almost anyone. But the counterfeiting case wasn't the only crisis Genovese faced in 1930. That same year, on February 26th, Genovese allegedly murdered Gaetano Reyna, the leader of a Bronx-based gang. Reyna had been a Mafia ally, but Joe the boss had grown suspicious that Reyna was secretly helping his arch-rival, Salvatore Maranzano. So Mafia ordered the hit, and Genovese carried it out. According to historical accounts, Genovese ambushed Reyna as he was leaving his mistress's house in the Bronx and shot him in the back of the head with a shotgun. This murder ignited something that would define 1930 and 1931, the Castellamarese War. Named after Salvatore Maranzano's hometown of Castellammare del Golfo in Sicily, this was a brutal conflict between Mafia and Maranzano for control of New York's Italian underworld. More than 60 mobsters would die before it was over. The streets ran red. Bodies piled up. Every day brought new violence. For most people, a gang war is chaos. But for Vito Genovese, it was cover. While newspapers screamed about gangland killings and the police scrambled to keep up with the bloodshed, nobody was paying attention to a counterfeiting case. Nobody was following up on the $1 million in fake currency. The violence provided the perfect smokescreen for Genovese to slip through the cracks. Think about what else was happening in 1930. The Great Depression was deepening. Unemployment was soaring. Banks were collapsing. The Castellamarese War was generating sensational headlines about Italian mobsters killing each other in the streets. Who cared about one more indictment against one more gangster? The system was overwhelmed. Law enforcement was stretched thin, and Genovese, always 10 steps ahead, used that chaos to disappear from official scrutiny. But Genovese wasn't just hiding from the law. He was building. While the war raged, he and Luciano were quietly making plans. They realized something that their bosses, Mafia and Maranzano, didn't understand. This war was bad for business. The constant violence drew police attention. It disrupted operations. It cost money. Both men needed to go. On March 30th, 1935, 5 years after the counterfeiting indictment vanished, police raided the Roberta's Pasticceria, an Italian pastry shop, and arrested Mike Sabatelli, described by the New York Times as a leading banker of the Italian lottery. The Mafia's annual take from the policy racket was estimated between $2 million and $10 million. During a simultaneous raid at the Eagle Printing Company on East 12th Street, police found 5 million slips printed for the Italian numbers game. 5 million betting slips. This wasn't a small operation. This was industrial-scale illegal gambling, and Genovese was at the heart of it. But by 1935, Genovese had evolved beyond the street-level enforcer who'd been indicted for counterfeiting 5 years earlier. The war had ended. Mafia was dead, murdered at a Coney Island restaurant on April 15, 1931, with Genovese allegedly one of the shooters. Maranzano had tried to reorganize the Italian and Sicilian gangs into what would become the Five Families, but he made the mistake of declaring himself boss of all bosses and plotting to kill Luciano and Genovese. So they killed him first. On September 10, 1931, assassins disguised as federal agents walked into Maranzano's office and murdered him. With both old bosses dead, Luciano did something revolutionary. He didn't declare himself boss of all bosses. Instead, he created the Commission, a governing body where the five family bosses would meet as equals to settle disputes, divide territories, and prevent future wars. It was organized crime, literally organized, and Vito Genovese, now underboss of what would later bear his name, was essential to making it work. This is where the 1930 counterfeiting case reveals its true significance. If that indictment had stuck, if Genovese had gone to trial and been convicted, none of what followed would have happened. He wouldn't have been there to kill Reina in February 1930. He wouldn't have been free to help Luciano plot the murders of Masuria and Maranzano in 1931. He wouldn't have risen to become underboss of the Luciano family. The entire structure of the five families might have looked different, but the case didn't stick. And the reason it didn't stick tells us everything about how organized crime really works. Genovese didn't beat the counterfeiting charges by being innocent. He beat them by making them irrelevant. Through a combination of bribery, intimidation, and strategic violence, he ensured that witnesses disappeared, evidence vanished, and prosecutors lost interest. This was his silent superpower, the ability to make problems disappear before they became trials. In 1934, Genovese and an associate named Ferdinand Boccia conspired to cheat a wealthy gambler out of $150,000 in a rigged card game. When Boccia demanded his cut, $35,000, Genovese decided it was cheaper to kill him than pay him. On September 19th, Genovese and 5 associates shot Boccia to death in a Brooklyn coffee shop. For years, that murder didn't touch him. The same protection that made the counterfeiting case disappear worked again. But in 1936, when Luciano was convicted on prostitution charges and sent away for 30 to 50 years, Genovese became acting boss of the family. He was at the height of his power. Then, in 1937, the Boccia murder finally caught up with him. Facing indictment when a hitman named Ernest the Hawk Rupolo began cooperating with authorities, Genovese fled to Italy with $750,000 in cash. Even from Italy, he kept building. He befriended Benito Mussolini. He ran black market operations. He ordered the 1943 murder of journalist Carlo Tresca for his anti-Mussolini reporting. When the Allies invaded Italy, Genovese offered his services to the U.S. military and became a trusted interpreter, all while running illegal rackets on the side. In 1944, U.S. military police arrested Genovese for running a black market ring that was stealing from the army. When investigators checked his background, they discovered he was wanted for the Boccia murder back in New York. He was extradited to face trial. But here's where the pattern from 1930 repeated itself. The key witness, Peter La Tempa, was poisoned to death in 1945 while in protective custody. Without La Tempa's testimony, the case collapsed. On June 11, 1946, Genovese walked free. The judge in that case, Samuel Leibovitz, said something extraordinary when he dismissed the charges. I cannot speak for the jury, but I believe that if there were even a shred of corroborating evidence, you would have been condemned to the electric chair. The judge knew Genovese was guilty. Everyone knew Genovese was guilty, but the witness was dead, and without evidence, there could be no conviction. This was a lesson Genovese had learned back in 1930 with the counterfeiting case. You don't have to be innocent. If you can make the case impossible to prove, dead witnesses can't testify. Missing evidence can't convict. Intimidated prosecutors can't build cases. The system only works when people cooperate with it, and Genovese spent his entire career making sure they didn't. He returned to New York and immediately began consolidating power. Over the next decade, he orchestrated murders and power plays to become the most powerful mobster in America. He ordered the hit on Willie Moretti in 1951. In 1957, he tried to have Frank Costello assassinated and succeeded in forcing his retirement. That same year, he ordered the murder of Albert Anastasia, shot to death in a barber's chair. To solidify his control, Genovese called a meeting of the nation's top mafiosi at Joseph Barber's estate in Apalachin, New York, on November 14, 1957. More than 60 mob bosses attended. It should have been Genovese's coronation, his moment to claim leadership of the commission. Instead, local police raided the meeting, arresting dozens and exposing the Mafia to public scrutiny like never before. The Apalachin meeting was a disaster for Genovese, but the real end came in 1959. He was convicted on federal narcotics conspiracy charges and sentenced to 15 years in prison. Many believe the conviction was a setup orchestrated by Luciano and rival boss Carlo Gambino, who'd grown tired of Genovese's ambition. Even in prison, Genovese continued to run his family, but his empire was crumbling. One of his fellow inmates was Joseph Valachi, a soldier in the Genovese family. In 1963, Valachi became the first made member of the Mafia to publicly testify about its existence before a U.S. Senate committee. The secret society that Genovese had helped build was now exposed to the world. Vito Genovese died of a heart attack in federal prison on February 14, 1969. By then, the family that bore his name was the largest and most powerful of New York's 5 families, a position it maintains to this day. But here's what that 1930 counterfeiting case really represents. It was a moment when Vito Genovese could have been stopped. $1 million in fake currency, a federal indictment, hard evidence. If the system had worked the way it was supposed to, Genovese would have gone to prison in 1930. The murders of Reina, Masuria, Maranzano, Boccia, Moretti, and Anastasia might never have happened. The commission might have formed differently. The Genovese crime family might not exist at all. Instead, the case disappeared. The charges evaporated. The system failed, not because it was broken, but because it had been bought. Police officers on the take. Prosecutors looking the other way. Judges accepting bribes. Witnesses too scared to testify. Evidence that somehow went missing. This wasn't a failure of law enforcement. This was law enforcement working exactly as Genovese had designed it to work for him. And in 1930, while America was distracted by economic collapse and gang warfare, nobody noticed. Nobody followed up. Nobody demanded answers. The article that should have exposed Vito Genovese was buried on page 14, if it appeared at all. The case that should have ended his career became a footnote. The $1 million in counterfeit currency became a historical curiosity. This is the real story of organized crime in America. It's not just about violence, though there was plenty of that. It's not just about illegal businesses, though those generated enormous wealth. It's about systematic corruption. It's about buying the people who are supposed to stop you. It's about making sure that even when you're caught red-handed with $1 million in fake money, nothing happens. Vito Genovese understood that in a corrupt system, the criminals who win aren't the ones who avoid getting caught. They're the ones who make sure that getting caught doesn't matter. He understood that investigations can be buried, witnesses can be silenced, evidence can disappear, and cases can collapse if you know the right people and have the right amount of money. The 1930 counterfeiting case should have been the headline that ended Vito Genovese's career. Instead, it became the footnote that proved he was untouchable. By the time federal prosecutors and the FBI realized what they were dealing with, Genovese had already built an empire on the foundation of that first disappeared case. The door wasn't just locked from the inside. The lock had been welded shut, and Genovese had melted down the key. The Genovese crime family that exists today is the direct descendant of that 1930 moment when the system failed. When police found $1 million in counterfeit currency, and somehow, someway, nothing came of it. When a young gangster named Vito Genovese learned that in America, if you have enough money and enough fear, you can make justice disappear. Sometimes the most important stories are the ones that never made the front page. The investigations that went nowhere. The cases that collapsed. The headlines that were buried so deep nobody remembered them. This is one of those stories. The article that should have exposed Vito Genovese, but didn't. The moment when the system had its chance to stop one of the most dangerous criminals in American history, and instead looked the other way. The $1 million in counterfeit currency was just the beginning. The real counterfeit was the justice system itself.